She had no map, only memory. A dirt road became a riverbank. The river became a marsh, and beyond it, darkness. Margaret's journey from Virginia began on a night that smelled of rain and firewood. The plantation dogs were barking at ghosts, or maybe at her shadow slipping past the stables. She didn't dare to breathe too loud, didn't dare to imagine what daylight might bring. For enslaved people like her, running wasn't just escape. It was an act of war against the laws that said she was property, against a world that had named her a thing. The stars above her weren't friendly. They seemed to watch, to whisper, to weigh her worth. She followed the North Star like it was a wound that never closed, knowing that each mile north meant one more heartbeat closer to life. The journey was carved in silence and terror. She had nothing but a ragged shawl, a stolen loaf of bread, and the promise of cold. Nights she slept under pine trees, wrapped in her own fear, and mornings she woke to frost crawling across her skin. She couldn't read, but she understood. The code of whispers passed among the enslaved. Follow the water, keep to the woods, and trust no white man who smiles too quickly. Her feet bled through the fabric tied around them. Her belly growled until it forgot how to. The cold didn't just bite, it carved her into something else, something raw, something unbreakable. When she crossed into Maryland, the world shifted. The accents were different, the faces colder, but the danger stayed the same. Slave catchers rode slow through towns, eyes sharp, hands resting on pistols. She hid in ditches when hooves thundered close, pressing her face into the dirt, whispering names of people she'd lost so the earth would remember them. Sometimes she thought she heard her mother's voice in the wind, singing the same song that had once lulled her to sleep in a cabin where rats gnawed through the walls. Her mother had said freedom was just breath. Margaret held on to that. Breath by breath, step by step. By the time she reached Pennsylvania, she had begun to forget what her own voice sounded like. In one village, a Quaker woman gave her a crust of bread and a new name to whisper at border checkpoints. "Call yourself Ellen," she said. But Margaret couldn't let go of her true name. It was all she had that belonged to her. The name had been given to her by a mother who'd known she'd never see her daughter grow old, so she kept it close, like a secret flame under the ribs. Every person who helped her along the way asked the same question: "You sure you want to go to Boston?" And every time she nodded. Boston, they said, was where the free ones went, where men like Frederick Douglass spoke in halls full of white faces pretending to listen, where no master's hand could reach. She clung to that dream like a scripture. Crossing into Massachusetts felt unreal. The land was different, rockier, harsher, but the air tasted like permission. When the train finally hissed into Boston, she stepped off trembling. The streets were narrow, the buildings tall and gray, the people dressed in black wool and arrogance. Snow fell soft, but the eyes around her were hard. White men hurried past without looking at her. White women clutched their shawls tighter. The other colored people she saw moved quietly, almost invisibly, as if reminding her that even here one must not draw too much light. She expected celebration, maybe a church bell ringing for her arrival. But freedom did not greet her with open arms. It greeted her with questions. She found temporary refuge in a boarding house on the edge of the North End, run by a widow who took in escaped souls for a small fee. The room was small, the walls thin, and the nights long. From her window, she could see the harbor, ships coming and going, carrying the same goods her hands once picked. She realized then that the North and South were not two worlds but one body with different faces. Boston wore the mask of morality, but the breath beneath it smelled of profit. Still, she tried to believe. She took work where she could. Washing clothes, scrubbing floors, cleaning out the soot from other people's fireplaces. Every task was a form of silence. But she was alive, and that was enough, for now. Sometimes she would walk past the meeting houses where abolitionists gathered, their voices booming about liberty and the sin of slavery. She listened through the windows, unseen. The words were beautiful, even if they didn't sound like her. But she noticed something peculiar. When they spoke of the enslaved, their eyes never seemed to rest on her. To them, she was an idea, not a woman. Freedom in Boston was a philosophy, not a promise. She met others like her, runaways who whispered stories over shared loaves of bread, each tale ending in a warning. "Don't trust them who call themselves helpers," one woman told her, eyes darting to the door. "They'll take your story, write it down, and still cross the street when you walk by." Margaret learned that freedom had rules. Don't walk too fast at night, don't speak too loud in public, and always carry your papers if you had them. Even free black men could vanish if someone decided they looked suspicious. Her hands remained rough, her back bent, her eyes tired. But something in her had begun to change. For the first time in her life, she could choose where to stand, where to sleep, what to wear. Those small freedoms became precious. Sometimes she stood by the harbor at dawn, the sea breeze lifting her hair, and tried to imagine her mother standing beside her, smiling at how far she'd come. She thought about the people still trapped on that plantation, still waiting for night to fall so they could dream of stars. Guilt gnawed at her, but she told herself she'd live enough for them all. It was in those moments of fragile hope that she noticed how the city began to look at her. Not with chains, but with curiosity. She was a story that others wanted to claim, a symbol for sermons, a face for pamphlets. But when she looked into their eyes, she saw not compassion, but ownership. The same kind that had haunted her in Virginia, now dressed in fine coats and polite words. Freedom, she realized, was not the opposite of slavery. It was a mirror reflecting who had the power to define it. Margaret's name, her scars, her silence, all of it became a quiet rebellion. She would not let them write her story for her. She had crossed a country built to stop her heart from beating. Every breath she took in Boston was an act of defiance, and though she did not yet know what waited for her in that house on Beacon Hill, she sensed that her struggle was far from over. The snow that began to fall outside her window seemed peaceful, but she'd learned not to trust softness. Beneath every white surface, there could be something buried, something that remembered. The dark. Boston liked to call itself the cradle of liberty, a city of conscience where sermons rose like smoke and men spoke proudly of justice. But beneath its cobblestone streets and candle-lit windows, the air was heavy with contradiction. The same hands that printed pamphlets calling slavery a sin were the ones counting profits from Southern cotton. The same preachers who thundered about equality from their pulpits hired colored women to scrub their steps and enter through the back door. For someone like Margaret, Boston was a maze of polite hypocrisy, a place where freedom was spoken of, more than it was practiced. She arrived believing the city was a sanctuary, but what she found was a theater. The abolitionists were its actors, their words rehearsed, their sympathy measured. They filled halls with righteous applause, speaking of the plight of the Negro, while never asking the woman mopping the floors what her own story was. To them, freedom was an ideal that could be debated, not a wound that still bled. Margaret would watch them from the shadows, their faces flushed with moral fire, and wonder how people could shout so loud for justice yet see her as invisible. The city itself had its own script. The Beacon Hill homes, polished and proud, were built on fortunes that came from slave-made goods. The ships in the harbor carried molasses, sugar, and tobacco, products soaked in blood that Boston merchants traded for profit, all while declaring their moral superiority. It was a strange kind of blindness, and Margaret walked among it like a ghost, feeling every stare that followed her through the narrow streets. The free black population in Boston lived mostly on the edges, small, tight-knit communities in the North End and on the slopes of Beacon Hill. They had churches, schools, and a sense of resilience that white reformers admired from a distance but rarely joined. Margaret soon learned that freedom in the North came with boundaries drawn in chalk. You could walk down the same streets but not beside them. You could speak in their kitchens but not at their tables. The difference between a Northern gentleman and a Southern master was often just the accent with which they said the word girl. Even among the abolitionists, there were hierarchies. Wealthy white men led the meetings, white women organized the charities, and the formerly enslaved were invited to tell their stories only when it made the crowd feel righteous. Margaret attended one gathering, invited by a woman who said her Story would move hearts. She stood at the back, listening as they discussed strategies to elevate the colored race. The words were smooth, the tone patronizing. When she finally spoke, her voice trembling, she said she did not need to be elevated, only believed. The room fell silent. The hostess smiled tightly, patted Margaret's hand, and said, "My dear, that's very brave." Then they moved on to the next topic, as if bravery were a polite decoration, not a survival instinct. She began to understand that Boston's moral power rested on distance. People could care deeply about the idea of slavery as long as it stayed far away. But a woman like Margaret standing in front of them with the proof of it etched into her skin made their comfort tremble. Her scars were not metaphors, they were reminders. And reminders were dangerous in a city that prided itself on having already done the right thing. Margaret often worked for families who boasted about attending anti-slavery lectures. They'd leave her notes on the kitchen table about where to polish, when to light the fires, and what food to prepare for guests who discussed freedom over imported wine. Their compliments were always the same. "You're such a good girl, Margaret." It was said with the same tone her old mistress used, a tone that carried ownership inside its sweetness. She learned to smile when they praised her cooking, to lower her eyes when they said she was lucky to be in Boston. Lucky. The word felt sharp in her throat, like a bone she couldn't swallow. The newspapers called Boston a beacon of progress. But the same papers also printed runaway slave ads from Southern masters who knew their property might be hiding there. The fugitive slave law hadn't yet tightened its grip, but bounty hunters already prowled the docks, bribing constables, flashing badges, and dragging men and women into the shadows. Even in this so-called free state, Margaret had to keep moving, never staying in one place long enough for a name to stick. She carried her silence like armor. Once, while running errands, she passed a group of boys in front of a print shop. They were laughing, tossing snowballs at one another until one shouted, "Catch the runaway!" and aimed one at her. The word struck harder than the ice. The shopkeeper laughed too, and no one said a thing. That was Boston's other face. The one that showed itself in alleys, in taverns, in whispers after dark. It wasn't the roaring hatred of the South. It was something colder, quieter, more poisonous. It came wrapped in manners and laws, built into the very stones beneath her feet. Night, she would lie awake listening to the city breathe. The church bells, the creak of wagon wheels, the low hum of wind between chimneys. Sometimes she thought about Virginia, the open sky, the cicadas, the smell of soil after rain. Boston had no softness, only edges. People spoke quickly here, as if afraid to be caught thinking too long. She began to sense the same kind of danger she'd left behind, only dressed in wool coats and polished boots. In the kitchens where she worked, she overheard conversations she was not meant to hear. Men talking about sending them back where they belong, women fretting about too many colored folks moving in. One evening, a guest asked her employer if he truly believed Negroes were equal to whites. The man chuckled and said, "In the eyes of God, perhaps, but not in the law of nature." Everyone laughed, including the wife who often boasted of her husband's progressive views. Margaret kept her eyes on the silver tray, her hands steady, her rage silent. She had learned that speaking the truth in Boston could make you disappear as easily as it could in Virginia. There were those who truly cared. Black ministers, women who risked their reputations to hide fugitives, sailors who smuggled people north under barrels of grain. Margaret found brief refuge among them, a flicker of solidarity that reminded her what humanity could look like. But even within those circles, there was fear. Everyone knew that Boston's tolerance was fragile, dependent on keeping peace with Southern money. A single scandal, a single confrontation, could unravel everything. And so silence became the price of survival, once again. The irony was cruel. In Virginia, she'd been hunted by men who owned her. In Boston, she was watched by men who pitied her. Both wanted her to stay in her place. The difference was only in tone. She noticed how the city's moral speeches always ended with applause, never with action. How people who claimed to despise slavery still refused to let a black child sit beside theirs in school. How even the most radical among them believed in freedom only when it didn't touch their comfort. Margaret's hope began to wither under the weight of those contradictions. She had escaped the whip, but not the hierarchy. She had crossed hundreds of miles to find liberty, only to realize that freedom was not a place. It was a performance, and she was expected to play her part quietly. Still, she endured. She worked, she watched, she learned. She could sense the city's tension beneath its civility, like a storm humming below a frozen river. And somewhere deep within her, she began to understand that the chains she thought she had broken were still there, only now they were invisible, forged by words, by glances, by the cold politeness of people who believed themselves good. The past followed her like a scent, thick, metallic, and impossible to wash away. Boston had its own ghosts, but Margaret carried hers from the South. Faces she could never forget, voices that echoed in her dreams, and the sound of leather snapping through humid air. Every time the wind blew through the narrow streets, she swore she could hear it, the whip, the cries, the hollow silence that came after. The city around her moved briskly, self-assured, but in the quiet corners of her mind, Virginia was still alive. The plantation never left her. It had simply changed shape, blending into the rhythm of this cold new world. When she scrubbed floors in Boston's mansions, her body remembered every movement, every kneel, every reach, every bow of her head. The walls might have been different, but the posture was the same. Sometimes, as she worked, her mind slipped backward into the old patterns. The smell of the overseer's boots, the sound of her mother humming to distract herself from hunger, the way the air turned still before punishment. She would catch herself trembling, the mop handle tight in her hands, and force herself to breathe, reminding herself she was no longer there. But her body didn't believe it. Her body remembered too well. At night, she dreamt of fields glowing, silver under moonlight, and of a woman's hand, her mother's, pressing against her back, whispering, "Run if you ever get the chance." Those words had followed her for years, and when the night finally came, Margaret hadn't looked back. Yet sometimes she wondered if freedom had truly been what her mother wanted for her, or if it was just the only mercy she could imagine. There were nights in Boston when Margaret would wake from those dreams gasping, reaching for that voice, only to hear the cold silence of a city that didn't know her name. The more she tried to bury the past, the more it bled into the present. When a door slammed too loudly, her muscles tensed before she knew why. When a man raised his voice, her vision narrowed and her heart galloped. She learned to anticipate danger even when it wasn't there, to measure every step, every word. Survival was an instinct that never left. It simply adapted. She smiled when spoken to, lowered her eyes when she felt watched, and carried her silence like a shield. But sometimes, when she caught her reflection in a window or the polished brass of a doorknob, she hardly recognized the woman looking back. Margaret had expected fear to end once she reached freedom. Instead, it became her shadow. In Virginia, she'd known who her enemies were: men with whips, women with cruel smiles, overseers with polished boots. Here in Boston, danger wore politeness. It shook her hand and called her dear. That was harder to fight. It was one thing to flee from open hatred. It was another to navigate kindness that demanded obedience. There were moments when she thought she'd finally outrun the past, like when she stood at the harbor watching the ships come in. The sea stretched wide and endless, and for a brief second she felt small but unchained. Then the scent of tar and smoke would twist into something else, something that smelled like the torches on the plantation, and she'd be pulled back, choking on memory. The past had a way of hiding in ordinary things: the creak of a carriage wheel, the hiss of a kettle, the sound of a man's footsteps behind her. Once, she passed a tailor's shop where a white woman was fitting a gown onto a mannequin. The gown was pale blue, made from fine cotton. Margaret stopped cold. That fabric, soft, shimmering, was the kind her fingers had picked, hour after hour, under the burning Virginia sun. The world tilted. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the dress that had cost her so much pain. A boy sweeping the steps asked if she was lost. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, her chest tight, her hands shaking. Boston was supposed to be new, untouched, but it was stitched together with the same threads as the South. Some nights, when the city quieted, she'd hear the bells from a nearby church. Their sound was solemn and distant, like a prayer. She didn't know the words to. She tried going inside once. The preacher spoke about forgiveness, about letting go of anger. Margaret sat in the back pew, her fingers digging into the wood, and thought of the faces of men who had laughed as they watched her mother collapse in the fields. Forgiveness. The word felt foreign, like a language she wasn't meant to speak. The preacher said that freedom came from grace, but Margaret knew better. Freedom for her had come from running until her lungs bled and her legs trembled. It came from fear, not grace. It came from choosing to live when the world said she couldn't. Boston's winter only deepened her sense of displacement. The cold cut through her bones like memory. It reminded her of the nights in Virginia when she'd slept on the dirt floor beside her mother, covering themselves with rags, whispering stories about warmth they'd never felt. The same chill that now crept into her attic room in the north seemed to carry those whispers back. She would lie awake, tracing the scars on her forearms, thin white lines that glowed faintly in the candlelight, and wonder if anyone in this city knew what it meant to bear history on their skin. Sometimes, she tried to speak of it. Once with a woman she met at the boarding house, a cook from Maryland who had fled 2 years before. They shared bread and tea, and in the quiet, Margaret began to talk. The words stumbled out, the sound of the whip, the weight of a child she'd lost, the face of the master's wife, watching with cold satisfaction. The woman listened, nodding slowly, her own eyes distant. When Margaret finished, there was a long silence. Then the woman said, "We don't heal. We just keep breathing." Margaret nodded, realizing that was the closest thing to truth she'd ever heard. She began writing her mother's name in the dust on her windowsill every morning. Not the plantation name, not the one they forced upon her, but the real one. It was her quiet ritual, her act of remembrance. No one else saw it, but it grounded her, kept her from dissolving into the anonymity Boston demanded. She knew that forgetting was a kind of death, and she had already died too many times before. Each day she walked through the streets lined with gas lamps, hearing snippets of conversation about the great struggle against Southern tyranny. Men argued over laws and politics while she carried buckets of water past them, unseen. They debated whether freedom should come gradually or immediately, as if it were a matter of timing, not survival. Margaret's memories roared in protest, but she said nothing. The city prized her silence. Her story was acceptable only when told by others, cleaned of its blood and shame. Still, in moments of stillness, she began to see herself differently, not just as a fugitive, not just as a survivor. There were times she felt something awaken, a spark, small but dangerous. It flickered whenever she refused to flinch, whenever she met someone's gaze instead of lowering her eyes. The memory of her suffering became not just a wound, but a kind of weapon. Each scar reminded her she had endured everything designed to destroy her, and still stood. The past did not fade, but it began to speak to her differently. It stopped asking her to mourn and started urging her to defy. The same memories that once broke her now whispered a command. Never again. Never let them make you small. Never let them believe you are grateful. She understood then that her freedom could not depend on geography or law. It had to live in her refusal. And so even as the weight of her memories pressed down, she carried them forward, not as chains but as proof. The woman she had been and the woman she was becoming walked together through Boston's cold streets, two shadows merging into one. The city could pretend not to see her, but she knew the truth that it could never hide from itself. The South was not behind her. It lived here too, dressed in civility, whispering in every parlor and sermon. And no matter how far she ran, she carried within her both the scars of what she had escaped and the strength to face what still lay ahead. The house on Beacon Hill stood like a monument to self-righteous comfort, its brick walls glowing faintly in the evening light. From the street it looked peaceful, respectable. But Margaret had learned long ago that beauty could hide rot. The merchant who hired her was known among Boston's reformers as a man of principle, a supporter of abolition, and a benefactor to the city's charities. His name appeared in newspapers beside speeches about freedom and the moral conscience of the North. When Margaret was offered the position as a domestic servant in his home, everyone said she was lucky. They said working for such a man would mean safety. That word again, safety. It followed her everywhere, spoken by people who had never known what it meant to be unsafe. The merchant's name was Jonathan Hale, and his house smelled of oil lamps, polished wood, and respectability. The first time she entered, Margaret felt the air tighten around her. Everything was neat, symmetrical, deliberate, like a stage waiting for its play. His wife, Eleanor, greeted her with a brittle smile and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. "We expect order in this house," she said softly, as though reciting scripture. "Jonathan is a man of faith. You'll find him fair, as long as you are obedient." Margaret bowed her head and murmured yes, because she had learned that every house had its own set of rules, and obedience was the only safe language to speak until one learned the rest. For the first few weeks, the work was steady and quiet. She scrubbed the marble floors, lit the fires, polished the silver, and washed linens that smelled faintly of lavender and salt. Mr. Hale rarely spoke to her beyond instructions. His tone was even, his words precise, his politeness practiced, but there was something in his gaze that unsettled her, something lingering, assessing. He would pause too long when handing her an item, or stand too close when asking a question. She told herself she was imagining it. After all, he was one of the city's leading abolitionists, a man who prided himself on virtue. Then came the nights when his footsteps echoed down the hallway after the household had gone to sleep. The first time, he claimed he'd come to check the kitchen fire. The second, to ask if she'd seen his book left near the hearth. The third time, he said nothing at all, just stood there, watching her as she folded linens by candlelight. His eyes had lost their pretense of moral distance. She kept her head down, her hands moving faster, her breathing shallow. When he finally turned and left, she exhaled so deeply it hurt. The next morning, his wife mentioned that she'd heard footsteps during the night. Jonathan smiled, his face calm, his tone affectionate. "You must have been dreaming, my dear," he said, and the subject vanished like smoke. Margaret realized then that the wife knew, or suspected, but she would never speak of it. Respectability demanded silence. As the weeks passed, the walls of that fine house began to close in. Margaret noticed how Mrs. Hale's gaze hardened each day, how her kindness turned brittle. She watched her husband's behavior with a mixture of denial and resentment, directing both emotions toward Margaret. Once, when Jonathan complimented Margaret's cooking in front of a guest, Eleanor's teacup trembled, and that night she gave Margaret twice as much work as usual. There was no escape from suspicion, no refuge from resentment. Margaret was caught in a web spun by politeness and power, two forces that ruled Boston as surely as whips ruled the South. One evening, during a gathering of prominent reformers, Jonathan asked Margaret to serve wine to his guests. They were all men, editors, lawyers, clergymen. Their conversation filled the room with words like virtue, progress, and moral duty. They praised one another for their compassion toward the colored people, all while never looking directly at the one serving their drinks. When Jonathan introduced Margaret as a fine example of what freedom can produce, the room laughed softly, approvingly. The praise felt like a hand pressing on her neck. She smiled because she had to, but her hands shook as she poured. That night, long after the guests had gone, Jonathan appeared again in the kitchen. His face was flushed with wine and self-importance. He told her she should be grateful to serve in a good home, that he had saved her from the dangers of the streets, from the men who would not treat her kindly. His words were smooth, almost tender, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Margaret froze. The candle flickered between them, the flame trembling as though it too could sense the tension in the air. When he stepped closer, she felt her breath vanish. The air smelled of alcohol and something older, entitlement, the scent she'd known since childhood. The way he said her name reminded her of Virginia, of the men who never bothered to ask permission. She had crossed states, survived hunger and frost, only to find herself standing in the same story again. For a moment she wondered if she'd ever truly left. In the days that followed, the house became unbearable. Jonathan's presence loomed in every corner, his shadow stretching across the walls even when he wasn't there. He began to find small excuses to summon her: misplaced books, letters that needed sealing, imaginary tasks designed to keep her close. His compliments grew bolder, his words dripping with the poison of false kindness. "You don't need to be afraid here," he said one morning, his voice low. "You're safe in this house." The word safe made her stomach turn. Mrs. Hale's resentment turned to quiet cruelty. She stopped speaking directly to Margaret, leaving her instructions scrawled in notes. Once, when Jonathan brushed past Margaret in the hallway, Eleanor's eyes flicked toward them, cold, sharp, accusing. Margaret wanted to explain, to scream that she was the one being hunted, but there was no language for that kind of truth. A servant's voice was not meant to carry beyond the kitchen door. At night, she began sleeping with a chair wedged beneath her doorknob. Every creak in the house made her body tense. The sound of his footsteps became a kind of nightmare she could not wake from. She thought about running again, but the city was full of dangers she no longer had the strength to face. She had already escaped once. How many times could a person flee before the world stopped giving them places to hide? Jonathan's behavior grew more erratic as winter deepened. He would corner her with questions about her past, asking how she'd escaped, who had helped her, whether she had ever been grateful to her former master. His tone suggested something darker, an obsession not with her story, but with his imagined ownership of it. He spoke of freedom as though it were his to grant, his to define. "I gave you a new life," he said once, leaning in close enough that she could feel his breath. "Don't forget who made you free." The words sliced through her like a blade. That night, as she scrubbed the kitchen floor until her hands bled, she realized the cruel symmetry of her life. The South had taken her body, the North wanted her gratitude. Both demanded her silence. Both claimed ownership of her existence. She stopped speaking except when necessary. Her work became mechanical, her face expressionless. Inside, something began to harden. She no longer prayed for protection, only for clarity. The world had never protected her, but it had taught her one truth: that power disguised as virtue was the most dangerous kind. The morning snow fell thick over the city, blanketing everything in deceptive purity. From the kitchen window, Margaret watched the flakes drift down, covering the roofs, the cobblestones, the filth. The world looked new, almost peaceful. She knew better. She had seen what lived beneath clean surfaces. She knew that men like Jonathan Hale built their reputations on lies, that every sermon and speech about freedom was paid for by women like her, silenced, unseen, and used. When the sound of his voice echoed down the hall again that night, she felt no fear, only certainty. She had come too far to bend again. The plantation was gone, but its ghost lived in this house, and ghosts could only be banished by truth, no matter the cost. The night Boston froze under a glassy silence. The house on Beacon Hill became a theater of dread. The lamps flickered low, the last embers of the fire dying like the pulse of something ancient. Margaret sat awake in her small attic room, her back against the wall, her knees pulled close. The chair beneath her doorknob cast a faint shadow, an improvised lock against the civilized madness of the house below. She could hear him moving, Jonathan Hale, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried, as though he were strolling through a dream he believed he owned. The clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chime hollow and cold. Every sound in that house had become a kind of language to her. The shift of wood, the creak of the stair, the scrape of boots on polished floorboards, all whispered intention. She had learned to survive by listening, and now the silence between those sounds felt like a warning. When the footsteps stopped outside her door, she stopped breathing. There was a pause, a soft pressure against the wood, a test. Then the faint rattle of the handle. The chair held. She closed her eyes, waiting, her heart thudding like a drum against her ribs. Another pause, then retreating steps. The quiet stretched on for what felt like hours, until she could finally breathe again. In the morning, nothing was said. He greeted her at breakfast as though the night had never happened, his voice pleasant, his smile practiced. Mrs. Hale sat opposite him, her eyes puffy from sleeplessness. She knew. Margaret thought. She always knew. But she would rather endure the ghost of suspicion than confront the truth that shared her table. Jonathan spoke cheerfully of sermons and meetings, his fork gliding through eggs, his voice steady, as if his virtue were unassailable. When he finally looked up and met Margaret's eyes, his expression softened into that same paternal smile he wore when guests were watching. "Miss Margaret," he said evenly, "I'll need your help with a few errands today." The tone was polite, but beneath it lay a command. She nodded without looking up. Her mind raced. She could not endure this much longer. The city beyond. These walls had become her only imagined salvation, but even there, freedom was a brittle thing. In the north, people smiled while locking the doors behind you. They preached morality while counting the cost of your presence. But still, somewhere, beyond this street, beyond this house, there had to be air she could breathe again. By afternoon, the errands led them to the wharf. Snow flurries drifted over the harbor, the ships rocking gently, ropes creaking in the wind. Jonathan walked beside her, his gloved hands behind his back, his voice smooth as polished glass. He spoke of business, of God, of the tragedy, of slavery. He called her child, a word that made her jaw tighten. To the world it would look like a kind employer guiding his servant through the market. To her it felt like walking beside the memory of every man who had once claimed to own her. When they reached a quieter street, he stopped and turned to her. His expression shifted. The warmth drained away, leaving something sharp beneath. You know, he said softly, how many men in this city would treat you as an object? You should be grateful for my restraint. The wind howled between the narrow alleyways, carrying the stench of fish and smoke. Margaret didn't answer. She stared past him at the harbor, where the masts of ships pierced the gray sky. Freedom had always been across the water. It was the cruelest kind of irony. Jonathan's tone grew darker. You think freedom means defiance, but you forget who gave it to you. You think Boston saved you, but it was men like me, men with influence. Without us, you'd be hunted still. His hand brushed against her arm, a calculated act disguised as concern. I want to protect you, Margaret. You belong with good people. Her body stiffened. Every instinct screamed to step back, but her years of survival had taught her that abruptness could provoke danger. So she stayed still, staring straight into his face. For the first time, she didn't lower her eyes. Something inside her had shifted, solidified. She saw not a savior, not even a man, just another version of the power she had fled. He mistook her silence for submission and smiled, a faint twitch of satisfaction. That night, when the household slept, Margaret packed what little she had, a shawl, a comb, a small Bible given to her by the woman at the church shelter. She moved quietly, every motion deliberate, rehearsed. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. The streets would be cold, dangerous, but nothing could be worse than another night behind those walls. As she crept down the back staircase, a floorboard creaked. She froze. Then a voice from the dark, his voice. Margaret. It was soft, almost gentle. She turned slowly. Jonathan stood in the hallway, a candle in hand, his face half lit, half shadowed. Where are you going? Her mind spun. She could lie, say she was fetching something from the cellar. But lies had weight. They slowed the body. She took a step forward, her breath steady. I'm leaving, she said, The words sounded foreign in her own mouth. She had never said them aloud before. He stared, disbelief flickering across his face like lightning. "Leaving?" he repeated. "You're under my protection." "No," she said quietly. "Not anymore." He laughed, a small, incredulous sound. "Do you think the world will be kind to you? You'll crawl back, begging for work, for shelter. You'll see. You'll come back." She didn't move. "I'd rather freeze on the street than live in your house another night." The silence that followed was absolute. The flame of his candle trembled. His expression shifted again, from disbelief to anger, from anger to something colder, emptier. "You ungrateful creature," he said, his voice low. "I took you in. I gave you a name, a place, respect. You gave me a cage," she said. He stepped closer, his face tightening. "Be careful, girl." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she turned, walked past him, and opened the door. The night air hit her like a baptism. Icy, sharp, real. Behind her, Jonathan's voice broke through the wind. "You'll regret this." She didn't look back. Boston's streets were silent, the snow crunching beneath her shoes. The city slept while she walked, invisible among its alleys and steeples. Somewhere, far away, a church bell tolled 2 in the morning. She had no destination, no plan beyond escape. But for the first time in her life, the word no had left her mouth, and the world hadn't ended. By dawn, she reached the docks. The harbor was a gray mirror reflecting the first hint of light. Sailors moved in the mist, their voices low, their breath visible in the cold. She approached a woman selling bread near a fire barrel. The woman looked up, her eyes tired but kind. "You're out early," she said. "I'm looking for work," Margaret answered. The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a tavern nearby. "They need someone to clean in the mornings. Ask for Ruth." Margaret thanked her and walked toward the tavern. Behind her, the city began to stir, the distant rumble of carriages, the creak of signs swaying in the wind. Life continued, unaware that somewhere on Beacon Hill, a man's illusion of control had cracked. Inside the tavern, the smell of yeast and wood smoke filled the air. A few sailors huddled near the hearth, their laughter rough but harmless. Ruth, a broad-shouldered woman with soot on her hands, eyed Margaret cautiously before nodding toward a bucket and broom. "You work hard. You can stay in the back room till you find your feet," she said simply. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She didn't say thank you. Gratitude had been twisted too often into a leash. Instead, she picked up the broom and began to sweep. The motion felt steady, familiar, yet different. Each stroke of the broom erased a little of the fear that had followed her. The sound of bristles on wood was its own kind of music, a rhythm of survival turned into freedom. Outside, Boston's streets glimmered with new snow, and somewhere far away, Jonathan Hale's house stood silent, its master pacing, its lies intact but weakened. Margaret didn't need to see it to know that the world inside those walls would go on pretending. But she was done pretending. She had crossed an invisible threshold, the moment when silence turned to defiance and obedience to truth. The city was still dangerous, the future uncertain, but for the first time, she was not someone's lesson in virtue or pity. She was her own story, walking through the cold, breathing in air no one had given her permission to take. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm, the kind that hides both exhaustion and rebirth. Boston's winter showed no mercy. Wind knifed through the narrow streets, and the harbor's breath froze into silver mist. But Margaret endured, it all with a kind of grim peace. She worked from dawn until the lamps were lit, scrubbing, sweeping, hauling water until her hands split open from the cold. The tavern was rough but alive, filled with men who shouted instead of whispered, who cursed instead of preaching virtue. Their faces were hardened by the sea, and though they looked at her, they did not look through her. There was a difference, and she felt it. Ruth, the tavern keeper, was a woman who had seen too much to waste sympathy on fear. She ran the place like a ship, every motion efficient, every command obeyed. "You do your work and don't let nobody talk down to you," she told Margaret one evening while pouring ale. "Boston talks pretty, but it bites harder than any man on those docks." Margaret nodded, understanding more than Ruth could know. She didn't speak much of her past. People in the tavern didn't ask. The regulars called her Miss Meg and left it at that. In their company, she learned the strange comfort of anonymity. It was the first time she could exist without being defined by her survival. But even in that small freedom, the ghost of Jonathan Hale lingered. Sometimes she woke in the night to phantom footsteps on the stairs, or to the echo of his voice, smooth, moral, certain. The past wasn't done with her. It never really was. News of him reached her indirectly. Boston's papers still printed his name in their society pages, praising his charity work and his speeches about justice. Once, a patron left a crumpled pamphlet on the counter that read, "Jonathan Hale to address the future of the abolition movement." The sight of it made her stomach twist. She wondered if he still walked through his house at night, convincing himself that what he did was love, not power. Men like him didn't need forgiveness. They needed exposure. But in 1847, the word of a black woman, especially one who had been enslaved, was not something the city wanted to hear. Still, there were those who would listen. One evening, a young journalist came into the tavern, a woman named Lydia Emerson, who wrote small editorials for The Liberator. She sat near the fire, her notebook open, her pen scratching furiously between sips of weak coffee. When Ruth introduced her to Margaret, Lydia smiled in that curious, unguarded way of people who have not yet learned fear. "Ruth tells me you've come a long way," she said. "Would you ever tell your story? There are people who'd want to hear it." The question startled her. For years her story had been a weapon used against her, retold by men who needed a symbol more than a person. The thought of reclaiming it, of speaking it in her own words, felt dangerous. "Stories don't change the world," Margaret said softly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "People listen, they cry, and then they go back to supper." Lydia smiled. Faintly, maybe, but sometimes one story makes the next one easier to tell. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking of what it meant to speak, to reclaim her own narrative. She remembered her mother's whisper in Virginia, the one that said, "They can take everything, but never let them name who you are." For so long, she had survived by silence. Now, the silence itself felt like a cage. A week later, she agreed to meet Lydia again, this time in a quiet room above the print shop. The air smelled of ink and damp paper. Lydia poured tea and asked her to begin wherever she wished. At first, Margaret's voice trembled. She spoke in fragments, about the plantation, the escape, the winter crossing, the house on Beacon Hill. But as she spoke, the words gathered force. They came out raw, unsparing. She described Jonathan Hale's sermons about virtue, the footsteps in the hall, the way he said safe like a command. Lydia's pen barely paused. When it was over, the room felt heavier. Lydia sat back, her face pale, her eyes bright with understanding. "People need to know this," she whispered. "They need to see what hides behind their own righteousness." But Margaret shook her head. "If you write it, don't use my name. He'll deny it. And they'll believe him. They always do." Lydia nodded slowly. "Then we'll tell it as a truth without a name. The kind they can't ignore because they'll see too much of themselves in it." The piece was published 2 weeks later under the title, "The Silent Rooms of Freedom." It spoke of a woman who had escaped slavery only to find herself trapped again, this time by the very men who claimed to stand for virtue. It didn't name Jonathan Hale, but everyone in Boston's reform circles recognized the portrait painted between the lines. The article spread quickly, read in parlors, whispered about in meetings, debated in drawing rooms. Some called it fiction, others blasphemy. Jonathan himself reportedly stormed into the Liberator's offices, demanding a retraction. He was met with polite denial. Margaret kept her distance from it all, continuing her work at the tavern as though nothing had changed. But she saw the ripple. Fewer people came to Hale's lectures. Donations to his charitable societies slowed. For the first time, the mirror of his public image cracked. Power, she realized, was most fragile when people began to doubt its virtue. One afternoon, Ruth handed her a folded newspaper, her thumb marking a small notice near the bottom. "He's leaving Boston," Ruth said simply. The notice read that Jonathan Hale and his wife were retiring temporarily from public life due to health concerns. Margaret read the words twice, then set the paper down. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a quiet emptiness. The world rarely offered justice, only small shifts in its balance. But even that small shift mattered. As winter gave way to thaw, Margaret began volunteering at a small church school near the docks, teaching letters to children of sailors and freedmen. The first time she held the chalk, her hands shook. She wrote a single word on the board: freedom. The children repeated it softly, their voices uncertain, as if tasting the meaning. She smiled faintly, remembering the night she'd whispered the same word into darkness, not knowing if she'd ever feel its weight. Boston still carried the same contradictions, the same moral pretenses, the same silences. But to her, the air felt lighter now. She no longer hid her story. She carried it like armor. People still looked at her with curiosity, sometimes with pity, but their eyes no longer defined her. She had learned that saying no wasn't just an act of refusal, it was an act of creation, the moment a person claimed the right to exist without permission. Lydia visited her often, bringing books and small bundles of food. They would talk by the fire about the world as it could be, about women who were learning to speak, about the slow erosion of fear. "Do you ever think you'll leave Boston?" Lydia asked once. Margaret stared out the window, watching the gulls dip over the water. "No," she said quietly. "I've been running my whole life. I think I'll stay right here, in the city where I learned to stop." Years later, when people spoke of the anonymous story that had shaken Boston's conscience, few knew the woman behind it still lived among them, teaching children to read, walking the same cobblestone streets she had once fled through. Sometimes in the early morning she passed by the old Hale house. It stood silent, its shutters closed, its bricks dull with age. To others it was just another fine house fallen out of fashion, but to her it was proof of something larger, that even the strongest walls could not contain the truth forever. She would pause for a moment, just long enough to feel the memory stir, and then walk on. The city around her was still imperfect, still full of ghosts wearing virtue's clothes. But she had learned how to face them. Each day she spoke her own name aloud, not to be heard, but to remember that it belonged to her alone. Years passed, and Boston changed in small, imperceptible ways. Cobblestones replaced, streets widened, faces shifting in the constant tide of progress. The city had a way of swallowing its own history, of turning scandal into silence and silence into memory. The old houses on Beacon Hill stood as they always had, brick facades glowing faintly in the sun, as if to suggest permanence in a world built on forgetting. But for Margaret, time did not erase. It clarified. The past was no longer a shadow. Following her, it was a compass pointing toward who she had become. By the 1850s, the movement against slavery had grown fierce. Meetings were held in church basements and newspaper offices, where men and women argued about morality, politics, and the price of freedom. Margaret attended some of them quietly, often sitting near the back, listening to the voices rise and clash. She had no interest in speeches or applause. But she watched, always watching, the way people spoke of freedom like a theory, something to be defined rather than lived. She saw the same patterns she had seen in Hale's parlor years ago. Men who wore righteousness like armor, women who nodded with polite fervor, and the unspoken distance between them and the people they claimed to represent. It was at one such meeting that she met Frederick Douglass. His voice was thunder, his words sharp as iron, and when he spoke of the freedom of the soul, Margaret felt something stir deep within her. After the speech, she approached him quietly. "You speak of freedom as if it's still to be earned," she said. "But for some of us, it's already taken, and we're just learning what to do with it." Douglas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Then you've already done the hardest part, he said. Their paths crossed a few more times in the following years. He would greet her with the quiet respect of one survivor recognizing another. They spoke not of politics, but of endurance, of how the world demanded constant proof of one's humanity. He once told her, "Some people mistake silence for weakness, but silence can also be a waiting place, the breath before truth finds its voice." Those words stayed with her. They reminded her of the years she had spent muted by fear, and the years after, when her voice became the only thing she trusted. She began writing small pieces for Lydia's paper, simple observations at first, reflections on labor, survival, and the illusion of safety. Her words didn't carry her name, but readers began to notice them, calling the anonymous author the Witness. It was Lydia who gave her that title, one evening over tea. "You see what others choose to look away from," she said. "And you write it so the silence can't close over it again." Margaret smiled faintly. "Witnesses are often the first to be forgotten." "Only by the guilty," Lydia replied. In the years that followed, Margaret became something of a quiet legend among Boston's black community. She helped newly freed people find housing, taught them to read, and guided them through the unspoken rules of Northern respectability. The irony was not lost on her, that she, once invisible, now spent her days teaching others how to be seen. But she did it not for admiration, but because she understood the cost of not doing it. Freedom without dignity was just another form of servitude. Then came 1857, the year the Dred Scott decision struck like a hammer across the nation. The Supreme Court declared that no black person, free or enslaved, could ever be considered a citizen of the United States. The ruling spread through the country like a poison wind. Margaret read it in silence, her hands trembling over the newspaper. For a moment, it felt as if all her years of struggle had been erased by a single sentence written by men who would never know her name. That night, she stood by the window of her small room, watching the snow fall again, just as it had on the night she escaped Jonathan Hale's house. She thought of the word no, how it had once been her act of rebellion, her weapon. It still was. The court could define laws, but not her existence. Freedom, she realized, had never come from permission. It had come from refusal. Her writing after that became sharper, angrier, but also more deliberate. She wrote about hypocrisy, about the Northern tendency to congratulate itself on compassion while benefiting from the same systems it condemned. "The North," she wrote in one essay, "loves the idea of the free Negro, but not the presence of one." It was a dangerous statement, even for an anonymous voice, but Lydia printed it anyway. The backlash was swift. Some donors withdrew support from the paper. Others demanded the writer's name. Lydia refused. "Some truths," she said, "belong to no one, and everyone at once." Jonathan Hale never returned to Boston. Rumors drifted. Over the years, of financial ruin, of scandal, of a death in obscurity somewhere in New York. Margaret never sought to confirm them. His name no longer had power over her. What haunted her now was not him, but the larger truth he represented, that evil often hides best in those who believe themselves righteous. In 1861, when war finally broke out, Boston roared with patriotism. Flags hung from windows, speeches filled the streets, and men signed up to fight for the Union. Margaret watched young boys march past her school, their faces alight with conviction. She prayed quietly for them, knowing that war could cleanse nothing but innocence. During those years, her students changed. Some were children of soldiers, others newly freed from the South, their eyes wide with disbelief at the concept of choice. Margaret saw herself in them, the same mix of fear and wonder. She taught them not just letters, but how to speak truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. Freedom, she told them, is not given, it's lived. Every day you decide who you are. By the time the war ended, Margaret was an old woman. Her hair had turned silver, her hands lined with labor, but her eyes still carried that same steady fire. The city around her celebrated victory, but she knew the deeper fight had just begun. The laws had changed, but the minds of men were slower to follow. She could feel it in the way some people still looked at her, curious, cautious, measuring, but she no longer shrank from those looks. She met them unflinching. In 1867, Lydia convinced her to let one story appear under her real name, the first time Margaret's identity would be public. It was titled The House on Beacon Hill. It told, without embellishment, the story of a woman who had escaped slavery only to face a different kind of bondage in the North. It ended not with vengeance or forgiveness, but with a simple declaration. I said no, and the world learned it could not own me again. The story spread farther than either of them expected. Abolitionists praised it as brave. Moralists condemned it as divisive. But for Margaret, it was neither. It was just the truth, long delayed, but finally spoken in her own name. That winter, she walked again past the old house on Beacon Hill. Its shutters were still closed, its garden overgrown. The snow muffled everything, and for a moment, she stood there listening, not to ghosts, but to silence finally emptied of fear. She placed her gloved hand against the cold brick and whispered a single word that no longer sounded like defiance, but peace. Then she turned away. In the years that followed, Boston forgot her name, as cities always do. Her story became a rumor, her words buried beneath newer voices. But sometimes, when the wind curled through the narrow streets and the snow fell just right, it carried a whisper, the sound of a woman's voice saying no, not as resistance anymore, but as the first breath of freedom. If you've stayed with us through the haunting story of Martha Green, then you already understand. This isn't just a story from the past. It's a mirror held up to the world we live in today. Her defiance wasn't simply about saying no to one man. It was about standing against an entire system that told her she had no right to choose. Stories like hers were buried for generations, written out of history books or reduced to footnotes. But every name, every whispered act of courage deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, think, or feel something you can't quite put into words, then make sure you're part of the journey we're building here. Subscribe to this channel, because each week we bring you forgotten truths, dark corners of history, and the lives that were silenced but never erased. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story might change the way you see everything, and now I want to hear from you. What moment in Martha's story hit you the hardest? Was it her quiet courage, the chilling danger around her, or that final moment when she dared to speak the word no? Leave your thoughts below. Your comments keep these stories alive. Let's talk about the parts of history that deserve to be remembered, not rewritten. Subscribe. Comment. Keep listening, because the past is still speaking, if you're willing to hear it.